You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute and is sponsored by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Hello, and welcome to episode 323 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. The Treaty of Paris that ended the American War for Independence in 1783 saw the United States grow in its territorial holdings. Well, it grew at least on paper. Within the 1783 Treaty of Paris, Great Britain ceded to the United States all lands east of the Mississippi River and between the southern borders of present-day Canada and Georgia. But how would the United States make good on its treaty right to settle this land? Answering this question proved to be a bit of a quandary for the new United States. After all, Great Britain's proclamation line of 1763 had greatly hampered and hindered settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. So, at the time of the Americans' independence, the great majority of the United States' population actually lived just along the eastern seaboard, from southern Maine down through Georgia. Another complication in settling lands within its territorial boundaries was the fact that the lands the new United States sought to bring within its orbit of governance were not unsettled lands. These lands served and still serve as the homelands of Indigenous peoples. So, how did the new United States plan to not only people these occupied lands, but to also bring them under the United States' control? Michael Witkin, a professor of history at Columbia University and a citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe, joins us to investigate the story of Anishinaabe, the homelands of the Anishinaabe peoples. The Anishinaabe lived and still live in the Great Lakes region in what early Americans called the Old Northwest Territory. And during our conversation, Michael will help us investigate how the United States went about transferring and incorporating these indigenous lands into American territory and into American governance. Now, during our investigation, Michael reveals details about the geography of Anishinaabe and the history of the Anishinaabe people, information about the economic, diplomatic, and political relationships the Anishinaabe created with the French, the British, and Americans between the mid-1600s and the mid-1800s, and how those relationships, or the political economy between these powers, changed over time, and the ways in which the new United States went about organizing, regulating, and incorporating the lands of Anishinaabe into the United States as new territories and new states. But first, did you know that Ben Franklin's World has a book club? The Poor Richard's Book Club is a listener-created and led reading group. It's a club that meets once a week on Tuesday nights, where members read and discuss chapters from a book that they selected. Now, thus far, all of the books have been those that we've already discussed on this show, or that we will discuss in a future episode. But group leaders Shari and Heather want to take you even further than our episodes can possibly take you. So each week, they work to find a guest expert to come in and discuss your readings with you. Now, to join the Poor Richard's Book Club or to learn more about it, visit benfranklinsworld.com/book club. That's benfranklinsworld.com/book club. And now, I think it's time for us to venture into Anishinaabe and the early Republic United States. Our guest is a professor of history and a professor at the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University. He is a citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe. His research specialties are in Indigenous and early North American history and in the history of the early Republic United States. He's written numerous articles and a couple of books, including Seeing Red, Indigenous Land, American Expansion, and the Political Economy of Plunder in North America, which was published by the Omohundro Institute and its publishing partner, the University of North Carolina Press. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Michael Witkin.
Hi, Liz. Glad to be here.
A lot of our conversation today is going to center on an area that many of us know as the Great Lakes region, which is known to its indigenous inhabitants, the indigenous people who live there, as Anishinaabe. Michael, as we're going to spend our entire conversation in this region, would you describe Anishinaabe for us and what this region was like to live in before the founding of the United States?
Anishinaabe is a pretty expansive term. It would mean the homeland of the Anishinaabe peoples, what the term would translate into. And the Anishinaabe peoples are speakers of Anishinaabe or the Ojibwe language. And in present day, especially, this is reference to people who would call themselves Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. But it would apply pretty expansively to peoples in those communities, mostly centered in the Great Lake. But the term applies to wherever Anishinaabe peoples have gone and migrated to and extended relationships with other peoples. Then during the early period, before contact, before the U.S., this would extend into the Ohio country, thinking of the Ohio River Valley, the Wabash River, the Momme River, even as far south as the Illinois country, and to the north, above Lake Superior and the boreal forests that cover the northern parts of Lake Superior. And then west, as far as Manitoba, Anishinaabe people have lived throughout this region and would call that space their homeland.
That really is an expansive geographic area. Could you tell us even more about the Anishinaabe peoples who lived and continue to live in Anishinaabe? What were their societies and lives like by the mid-18th century?
Sure. This was a patrilineal society that lived sort of according to a seasonal round, moving to places within a larger territory as resources were seasonally abundant. This would include the sort of hunting and trapping that easily folded into the fur trade, particularly during winter months. But then also other parts of the year would include harvesting maple sugar, another important sort of staple in Anishinaabe-Waukee country, seasonal fish runs, harvesting wild rice. So people would be moving throughout the landscape as resources became seasonally abundant, and then periodically gathering at times of the year when larger groups could be sustained in villages like Sault Ste. Marie, also places like Mackinac, and then later places like Detroit. So villages that were often in waterways, because the Great Lakes obviously is this sort of interconnected world by lakes and waters and rivers. And really, these waterways facilitate travel, and large villages were often at places where you would have to sort of interrupt the travel. The Falls of St. Mary or Sault Ste. Marie, as I mentioned, were a place where the falls that connect to different Great Lakes, and you would have to get out and portage. And so there was a large village at that location. Mackinac, same thing at the straits leading to Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, places where there would be moments when people would gather during different times of the year, would be these large village sites. So people live in the larger villages, disperse out, and according to the seasonal round at different spaces within their larger territory, as I said, harvesting seasonal resources.
I can't help but think about winter as you're talking about the seasonal rounds, because, the Great Lakes region isn't known for its sunny, warm winters. It's known for snowy, sub-zero temperatures where it can sometimes be impossible to move. So I have to imagine that when we think of these seasonal rounds, and especially the winter seasonal rounds, that the Anishinaabe would have had to become quite adept and very intentional about how they navigated this freezing and often inclement weather of winter and the other seasons of the year as well.
In the southern part of this territory, where the Potawatomi lived for the most part, what would now be southeastern Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, those countries, there you would have a seasonal round that, because of the more southerly location, allowed you to practice something that was more like traditional indigenous agriculture, harvesting the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, something that you would see throughout North America among Native communities that were agricultural in focus in terms of economic production. But in the more northern spaces, like think of northern Michigan, northern Wisconsin, and Minnesota, in these territories, the growing period didn't really facilitate that kind of agricultural production. So you had to really sort of rely on a seasonal round that harvested resources, some like wild rice, particularly in the western parts of the Great Lakes. Wild rice harvesting was a super important, stable commodity, but then also hunting, trapping, and fishing during different parts of the year. Winter months were usually reserved where larger village communities would break up and bands would move out into hunting territories where the population would be smaller during the winter months, often extended families, a clan, a dodem, and clan communities who would hunt this territory, trap this territory during winter months. And then as the spring approached, there would usually be fish runs as rivers broke up. Also, maple sugar would be something that we do in the early spring months. And then fishing, and obviously in the lakes during the summer months, gathering during the summer and fall. So you would be moving between these spaces that centered on village life, but also connected you to hunting territories that were associated with your clan or dodem during winter months in smaller living communities. and moving back and forth between these different spaces as resources were sort of seasonally abundant. And this was the kind of thing that very much easily incorporated the fur trade because you already had hunting and trapping as an important part of the seasonal round in these northern territories. And fur-bearing animals that were valuable in the fur trade, like beaver pelts, were more thick in these northern territories and more valuable. So this became one of the locus of the fur trade, is that this sort of northern territories, the Great Lakes, and the territory in the boreal forest north of the Great Lakes, kind of west onto the prairies, and what would now be sort of Manitoba, were all fur-bearing animals were really valuable for the fur trade.
Okay, now that we have some grounding in the Anishinaabe ways of life, I think we should turn now to the Anishinaabe people themselves. Michael, you've already mentioned the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and in your book, Seeing Red, you also mentioned the Odawa. Could you tell us more about the peoples of Anishinaabe-Wauke?
Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples are all Anishinaabe peoples. They are distinct, but they also are often intermarried. So if you are at a village, Sault Ste. Marie, for example, is a village that is primarily an Ojibwe village, but there would be a lot of intermarrying among Odawa and even Potawatomi people. The same thing was true for Mackinac. This was primarily an Odawa village, but there would have been also a lot of Ojibwe people and Potawatomi people intermarried among these communities. So in that sense, while you had distinct identities, there was a lot of intermarriage, there was a lot of interconnection, and people thought of themselves in terms of that identity. But identity also sort of moved between different registers. There's Anishinaabe people that are sharing the language, a sense of ceremony, the culture. And there's also a village level identity. You're from Sault Ste. Marie or Mackinac. And then there's your clan identity, your Dodam. So all these different sorts of identities were registers in which people would identify according to the social situation and were very much sort of interrelated. It's not too different from today. You could be from a town, a state, the United States in that sense. And so the same sort of register in terms of shifting identity, often based on location, social relations with other people, things like that.
Speaking of social relations with other people, one of the ways that many Indigenous peoples came into contact and formed trading partnerships with European and American colonists was through a trade like the fur trade. And Michael, you mentioned that the Northern Great Lakes region has some of the finest, most lush beaver and animal pelts anywhere in North America because of the region's cold and inclement winters. Could you tell us more about the fur trade and how this trade fit into Anishinaabe ways of life and introduce them to European and American colonists?
Sure. The fur trade is a really sort of important part of early North American political economy. The fur trade in the Great Lakes is more or less established by the French when the French Empire is created with founding of New France. It changes over time. The end of the 7 Years' War, when the British sort of take over Canada, the British Canada, the fur trade shifts into terms of British traders. But from the outset, the earliest period of colonization, there is an interest in exchanging basically manufactured items from Europe with processed animal pelts. The fur trade becomes a real source of wealth, particularly for New France. It's really important to the political economy of the French Empire. And so it very much structures not only the sort of political economy that makes the French Empire possible, but really the relationships between French settlers and Indigenous people. The French are able to sort of use the fur trade as a means of creating ongoing social relationships with Anishinaabe people in the Great Lakes. And they can therefore kind of make claims about the French Empire extending into the Great Lakes and into the West, when in fact they really don't have the capacity to sort of extend. They don't have settlers in the Great Lakes. They have kind of fur trade outposts. They have some missions, but they have relationships with Native peoples that are very much sort of a part of this fur trade exchange. And you can't really separate that exchange process from the social and political relationships that go with it. So in other words, the creation of an ongoing social relationship is usually configured as an alliance, and the alliance in Indigenous terms is configured as the creation of a kinship relationship. So in this sense, the fur trade becomes completely integral to the existence of the French Empire. The empire exists because of its relationship with Native peoples and the fur trade, and they're all deeply intertwined.
Wow. The fur trade sounds really important for the French, not only in terms of the wealth that the French are able to create from the furs they traded for, but really in terms of their ability to claim the territory they do under the label of New France. They're able to claim these Western territories, as you mentioned, not actually because French people held them, but because their relationships with the Anishinaabe peoples allowed them to nominally have a presence there. I'm curious what the Anishinaabe then got out of the fur trade. What kinds of goods are they receiving as a result of the fur trade? And what are they getting out of their interactions with the French and perhaps other European traders?
One of the things about the fur trade, or trade in general in early North America, is that both Europeans and Indigenous people benefited enormously from the exchange of goods. Sometimes trade gets characterized in sort of popular mythology as the sort of uneven exchange. The most famous you can think of is maybe the purchase of Manhattan for the small amount of trade goods, usually characterized as glass beads, that kind of thing. But in fact, this isn't really what happens. In part, what happens with the exchange of goods is you could think about the kind of life-changing sort of technologies entering into Indigenous communities and unbelievable wealth entering into European communities. An example of early fur traders that were trading in the Great Lakes region would interact with Native peoples and acquire beaver pelts from them, often beaver pelts in the forms of robes. And the robes that were most valuable were robes that had been worn, because the trigger hairs of the beaver pelts would be sort of removed from the process of wearing the garment. And so those garments, which were sort of partially processed, became valuable trade commodities. So a discarded robe could be traded with the European for trade goods like kettle, an axe, metal-aged weapons, awls, the sorts of manufactured items that you couldn't have that could be life-changing in terms of the sort of domestic work that it takes to reproduce your society. And so trading old robes for axes and kettles and awls and knives seems like a really good deal for Indigenous people, because you're giving discarded garments for goods that would have a huge impact in your just daily life. And for Europeans, they were getting pelts that represented sort of a form of extracting wealth in North America that they could get for the exchange of things that were easy for them to produce and trade with Native peoples.
One aspect of the fur trade that you mentioned that was really important to both Indigenous peoples and Europeans was the ability to conduct diplomacy and politics within the trade. And other guests have spoken with us about how Native Americans conducted diplomacy and politics that suited their needs and interests, and not always the needs and interests of the empires and peoples that they were conducting a trade with. And I wonder what this looked like with the Anishinaabe. What types of politics and diplomacy did the Anishinaabe work into their trade with Europeans?
So politics would often involve basically communities within Anishinaabe positioning themselves in a most advantageous way within this larger trading network. You have really trade relationships through the networks of Native alliances that stretch out into the center of the continent. And as an example, I've seen records from the late 1600s where Native peoples, Assiniboine and Cree peoples who are living what would now be Manitoba, are trading with Ojibwe and French traders at the western edge of Lake Superior, and then alternating that trade between the Native and French traders at Lake Superior with English traders on the coast of Hudson's Bay. The trade goods that they're exchanging, they're processing beaver pelts from the center of the continent, trading them through these different networks, an English network or a French network, through the Great Lakes or through Hudson's Bay. And those processed beaver pelts make their way to Europe, often to Great Britain, where they are processed and turned into hats or garments, usually by French Huguenots who've left France as a result of religious persecution and have kind of cornered the market in the felt trade. And then those trade entered the British sort of global empire of trade. So as early as the 1600s, you have Native people who have no direct contact with Europeans or European empire engaged in the global market economy that is emerging in this sort of early modern era. And so this kind of trade network is part of the emergence of a sort of early modern world economies, early modern societies. And you've got Native people involved in this sort of global trade network from the 17th century. And so in that sense, you have Native peoples that are part of the sort of emergent modern world system from almost the moment of colonization.
Now, a lot of what Michael discusses in his book, Seeing Red, involves the transition from the British claiming governance over Anishinaabe to the Americans claiming governance over Anishinaabe. Michael, before we start digging into the post-revolutionary period, could you help us better understand the transition that occurred from a French presence in Anishinaabe to a British presence in Anishinaabe after the 7 Years' War ended in 1763?
What makes the French Empire so expansive is the relationship with Native peoples. And this is true throughout the period of the French Empire. What begins to change is that as the English Empire and English colonies expand on the eastern seaboard, those colonies and the colonists that settled there, as they become more aggressive later into the early 1700s, into the mid 1700s, and begin expanding beyond the eastern seaboard and try to cross the Appalachian Mountain chain into what the English called the back country, what we could think of as West Virginia, Western Pennsylvania, even as far as the Ohio country. As English settlers begin to push into this territory looking for land that is less expensive and more accessible, they run into native peoples who are unwilling to sort of cede their territory. And English settlement is based on a sort of ideological construct that thinks of the New World as a place that is unsettled. This is a sort of natural law philosophy that has construed North America as a place that hasn't been turned into private property and therefore hasn't been settled. So even though English settlers realize there are native people there, they've created a sort of ideological construction of thinking about the New World as a place that is unsettled because they don't see private property in a way that is recognizable to an Englishman. As the English begin expanding into what they think of as unsettled territory, but what native peoples think of as their homelands, in terms of being a hunting territory or just indigenous territory, there's increasing competition over sort of the ability to control land. And by the time we run up to the 7 Years' War, one of the main points of conflict between the French Empire, the English Empire, and the different native peoples that are associated with those two different empires is their contention over land and land ownership. And this is, I think, one of the driving factors that shapes both the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, is the sort of increasing understanding by native peoples that settlers, but particularly English settlers, are trying to carve out territory that will remove that land from indigenous possession, that will sort of eat up their homeland and turn it into property. And so it becomes a really big point of contention, a big point of conflict. And this is one of the big things that is driving the conflicts that resulted in the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution.
It sounds like when the English moved into the Great Lakes region, or Anishinaabe after the end of the 7 Years' War, that Indigenous and European relations and politics and diplomacy, well, they all became much more complicated.
Indeed, they do. And I think one of the things that happens, particularly around the 7 Years' War and then the American Revolution and even into the War of 1812, is you have an increasing realization by the sort of large groups of native peoples east of the Mississippi, particularly in the Northeast, but also extending to the Southeast. You have the formation of what becomes a really large confederation in what the Americans will call the Old Northwest, which is this sort of region of the Great Lakes through the Ohio country and Illinois country, as well as what would now be upstate New York with the Iroquois Confederacy. You have these confederacies of native peoples that are increasingly coming together in the realization that they are in a pitched battle with English settlers for the control of their homeland. And one of the things that distinguishes sort of native diplomacy that exists between native people, say the way that the Anishinaabe connect with the people of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, is this concept of thinking of the lands of their homelands as a sort of shared territory. The terminology that they use is a common dish with one spoon. And there is an idea among indigenous people, particularly in the face of a growing English colonial settlement, that land and territory must be held onto in this collective sense, this idea of dish with one spoon. And so negotiations with native peoples are that they recognize among each other that no individual native nation can sign away the rights to territory, because so much of the land from east of Mississippi into the territory of the Appalachians is land that is distinct in terms of territory, but also jointly occupied. So the lands that the Anishinaabe occupy, the Odawa, the Ojibways occupied a shared space that overlaps with Iroquois territory along its borders, say the territory we now think of as Detroit in Ontario, and the territory of Anishinaabe and the Iroquois overlaps to the farther south with the Ohio country native peoples who are living in the Mome and Ohio River valleys. But these are territories that are, in part because of the seasonal rounds that I mentioned, they're not finite territories, they're overlapping territories that people have to sort of learn to occupy alongside of neighbors that they forge relationships with. And so in that sense, native diplomacy is very much emerging in this period in contradistinction to the European Empire as thinking about territory or homeland as something that can't be divided up among nations, or certainly not divided as individual property, but that must be held on to collectively. And the push against Europeans, particularly English colonial settlers who are wanting to come west into what they call the backcountry or Indian country, and then carve out relationships with distinct Indian communities, often village communities not even necessarily whole Indian nations or tribes, but rather Indian communities that are associated with a particular village. They want to create treaties or relationships that sign away rights to property, rights to territory. And that's the sort of tension point between negotiations with peoples of empire and indigenous people, is different conceptions of land and land ownership. And it becomes a real point of tension as English people keep trying to negotiate for acquisition and access to land. And Native people keep wanting to say that we not only don't want to give up our land, but we don't recognize the right of one particular nation to sort of sign off on land sales that would affect everybody else. So there's a sort of collective sense of ownership, this common dish with one spoon, that is very much in distinction with the European colonial settlement patterns.
Pressure to turn some of this communal land into private property through treaties really continued to mount after the American Revolution, when the Treaty of Paris 1783 recognized the new United States' rights to territory east of the Mississippi River. Now, one of the things that Michael makes clear in his book, Seeing Red, is that after achieving independence, one of the United States' very first goals was to establish diplomatic relations with the many indigenous populations who lived within the new nation's borders. So again, we're talking about territory that more or less extended from the eastern seaboard west to the Mississippi River. Michael, could you tell us why that was? Why it seemed so urgent for the new United States to establish diplomatic relations with indigenous peoples after the War for Independence?
So the Treaty of Paris settled the 7 Years' War and transferred New France to the British Empire, essentially transferred land from the Mississippi to the Appalachians to the British Empire by right of discovery. That same land transfer is made in the Treaty of Paris that ends the Revolution. And so the U.S. claims this vast territory that represents a potential land base for an expansive republic. And founders like Thomas Jefferson believe that the accessibility of land for the creation of new farms is essential to the functioning of a republic. You need an independent citizenry who are independent because they are individual landowners. And so from the moment of the revolution afterwards, there is a desire to figure out how to access and incorporate the land that has been granted by right of treaty into the United States, but hasn't been formed as part of any one of the original 13 colonies. It's so important, in fact, that the first congressional committee that's formed is the Committee on Indian Affairs. So the minute there's a U.S. government, the first committee that they form, the first order of business is to establish the Congressional Indian Affairs Committee. And one of the first things that committee does is to reach out to George Washington, not only the sort of the President of the United States, the first president, but also the person who has a long history in the Ohio country as a land speculator, as a soldier in the 7 Years' War, as a leader of the American Revolutionary Forces. And the committee chairman, James Duane, asks George Washington to inform him about what the Indian policy of the United States should be. And in a nutshell, George Washington says our Indian policy is our land policy, because he recognizes from the beginning that the U.S. needs access to this Western territory, both to accommodate the sort of growing settler population of the early republic, but also because they desperately need a revenue, because the revolution has left the newly formed republic in debt, and they're looking to this land as a way to get out of that debt. Also, many of the soldiers who fought in the revolution were paid in land scrips. That is, the claims that various formerly English colonies or the new states have on Western territory. They ended up paying soldiers by offering scripts that promised them land in this Eastern territory. Federalist Paper number 7, written by Alexander Hamilton, talks about the need for the early republic to consolidate this land as sort of federal territory, acknowledging it as what they call crowned lands or unsettled lands. This gets back to this idea of North America being an unsettled territory. And Hamilton, Federalist number 7, says this is the key to the future of the United States. The individual states give up their land claims in the West and recognize this as the territory of the federal government, which can then be sort of transferred to a public domain or made available to citizens. So the first Congressional Committee on Indian Affairs reaches out to George Washington and asks him, what is our Indian policy? And George Washington says in a response in a letter to James Duane that at first view it may seem extraneous when I am called upon to give an opinion upon the terms of a peace proper to be made with Indians, that I should go into the formation of new states, but the settlement of the Western country and making peace with the Indians are so analogous that there can be no definition of one without involving consideration of the other. So George Washington from the get-go realizes that America's future is tied with its ability to sort of take this Indian land and conceptualize it as public domain, own that public domain as the federal government, and then make that public domain available to its citizens for purchase as individual private property.
And one of the ways that the United States goes about making these Western lands available to American settlers starts even before George Washington takes office as president. The Confederation Congress, the Congress that operated the government of the United States under the Articles of Confederation, the Confederation Congress worked to organize these quote-unquote unsettled lands by passing acts known as the Northwest Ordinance. Michael, would you tell us about the Northwest Ordinance Acts and how these acts attempted to regulate the organization, sale, and even the settlement of Western lands, which were indigenous lands?
One of the things that the politicians like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington realized was that this territory that they had a claim to by treaty, but which was occupied by Indians, represented a lot of promise, a lot of potential bounty for the Republic, but also was a precarious sort of thing. They didn't have a firm hold. They couldn't project the power of a federal government onto that territory at this point. There were still powerful native nations that lived there. And so they had multiple worries. They wanted to be able to transform that land from native homeland into public domain that could be made available for sale to their settlers. But they also worried that the settlement of that land, if not controlled properly, could lead to some sort of new spin-off settlement that was outside of the control of the United States, either because settlers who went out and settled land sort of in an unregulated fashion might form a new polity, or that they might form a polity that then aligned itself with the other still competitive European powers, Great Britain or the Spanish Empire. So they both wanted to regulate land settlement and then also minimize the potential for conflict, because they knew that Americans settling onto this land would be a point of contention with native peoples, and that the potential for sort of endless warfare was also another important element of Western expansion. And the Northwest Ordinance tried to solve both these problems. It created a series of laws that, one, dictated that only the federal government could acquire land from native peoples, so individual settlers could not, and individual states could not acquire land. That was an important provision of the Northwest Ordinance. And at least in terms of the ordinance itself, government promised that they would not take land from native peoples, but with their consent. Actually, near than that, they said they could take land in a just war or by consent in negotiation with native peoples through treaty. And then they set up the provisions for how that land would sort of be converted into private property, and how the private property could be converted into a sort of polity that could be absorbed into the early republic. And then they created a law that said 5,000 free settlers in a territory would be sufficient to establish that territory as a territory administered by the federal government. So once you had 5,000 settlers in the Northwest Territory, that's the region that we can now think of as Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota. The federal government would appoint a governor and a judiciary. There would be a locally elected advisory council and a locally elected congressional delegate who would be a non-voting member of the U.S. Congress. With the establishment of that sort of territorial control, as a territory with 5,000 settlers could be turned into a state, with the growth of that territory to reaching the point of having 60,000 free inhabitants. At the point where the territory has 60,000 inhabitants, they could create a state constitution and petition for admission into the Union as a state with all the rights and privileges of the original 13 colonies. Another important feature of the settlers in this territory had all the sort of rights and privileges of U.S. citizens. So right of habeas corpus, the right of property rights, inheritance rights, freedom of religion, all the sort of things that were the hallmarks of the rights and privileges that came with U.S. citizenship would be applied to settlers who established themselves in these newly formed territories. Another feature of these territories was that not only were these rights established, the federal government would be a large presence. They would establish the chief executive, but the federal government also asserted a right in terms of the waterways. They established the St. Lawrence and the Mississippi as communal spaces that couldn't be owned by individuals or claimed by states, but that would be sort of open navigation, because that was the other point that they realized the ability to sort of incorporate these new territories into the political economy of the Republic was super important for their incorporation into the Union. So in this sense, the Northwest Ordinance created a sort of legal framework for essentially taking indigenous territory, extinguishing native title to that territory through a treaty process, transferring that indigenous title land to public domain, and then through the public domain, surveying that land and making it available for sale to free settlers of the early republic. Now, as I said, free inhabitants, the Northwest Ordinance specified that free settlers were the condition for creating the territory and state, but those territories, as they turned into states, created state constitutions that also further refined that to be free white settlers. So they did have a component to citizenship that was hinged on race. Also, the other element of the Northwest Ordinance was that all states created through the ordinance had to have feature a slave clause and be free states. So they were established as free territory.
The acts of the Northwest Ordinance really did a lot to help the United States accomplish its goal of turning these vast swaths of native lands into organized, privately held American lands under the nominal control of the United States. And when we look back at history, it tells us that the United States and its people were really happy with this arrangement, that the Northwest Ordinance Acts were seen as one of the first successes of the new United States government. But I'm curious, Michael, what do the Anishinaabe think about these United States laws that were designed to consume their land and to really push them off of it?
Well, the first response was one that resulted in military conflicts. As I mentioned, the common dish with one spoon was the approach that in the aftermath of the revolution, this confederation of native peoples, mostly centered in the Northwest, involving Anishinaabe peoples, the Wyandot or Huron, the Iroquois Confederacy, the Ohio Country peoples, approached the United States with the idea that they were asserting this common dish with one spoon idea that we want to hold on to our territory, that you can't negotiate a discrete treaty with, say, the Delaware or just the Potawatomi from Ohio, but that we are all collectively negotiating and we are holding on to this territory. So there was resistance to the press by the United States to extinguish title and incorporate territory. And this sort of disagreement about negotiating for the extinction of title led the U.S. to sort of form treaties, a couple of different treaties with persons among these confederations who would be willing to sign treaties. And so they had a couple of treaties that were signed early on that weren't recognized as universal. This conflict over what that meant, that the U.S. had treaties that they claimed gave them right to access territory in the West, that the large majority of Native peoples didn't see as legitimate treaties, led to two military conflicts. The first two conflicts faced by the independent United States, the battles in the Ohio Country that involved American military defeats, first with Josiah Harmer, who was the commander of the Army of the Northwest, who was roundly defeated by the Confederation forces of Native peoples in the Ohio Country. A year or two later, the U.S. tries to rally the governor of the Northwest Territory, Sinclair, leads the armed forces into the Northwest Territory, into the Ohio Country. He also was defeated. At this point, the U.S., which had come out of the Revolution with an idea that standing armies were an anathema, and so had dissolved the Continental Army and had sort of formed the Army of the Northwest through a really small professional Army Corps and state militias, realized that this wasn't going to get the job done in terms of the confrontation with Native peoples. And so they had to give up their objection to a standing army and fund an army, which they do. And then Anthony Wayne becomes the commander of that army and leads U.S. forces into the Ohio Country for a third time and is successful with the Battle of Fallen Timbers in defeating this confederation of Native peoples. Although that defeat is partly a military victory, but it's also partly diplomatic, because at the same time as Anthony Wayne as leading forces into the Ohio Country against this confederation of Native peoples, the U.S. negotiates what's called the Jay Treaty with Secretary of State John Jay, which is negotiated with British Canada, and it recognizes the sort of northern border of Canada, but it also extracts a concession in recognition for this northern border from the British, who, even though they've signed the Treaty of Paris and had ceded territory to the U.S., they have maintained forts in what was the ceded territory. So they had forts in what would now be Michigan, Detroit. And those forts were places where this confederation of Native peoples were able to sort of resupply and get provisions and goods. And when those forts, at the same time as General Wayne is marching into their territory and close to them, they can't resupply, they very quickly sort of lose an advantage in terms of their conflict with the Americans and suffer this defeat, enter into a negotiation and sign the Treaty of Greenville, which is the first big treaty the U.S. signs with Native peoples. And this treaty theoretically establishes a boundary between Native North America and the U.S. at the Ohio River. And the U.S. pledges that it won't try to settle territory north of the Ohio. It also creates the basis for a relationship, ongoing relationship with Indigenous peoples that are in territory claimed by the United States by creating a treaty relationship where the Native peoples recognize the sovereignty, overall or paramount sovereignty of the United States, where they agree to accept an annuity that is a payment for the territory that they have ceded south of the Ohio Country. The payment is a combination of cash, money, and trade goods and provisions that will be given annually. And they also accept a provision of the treaty that calls for their civilization. The U.S. pledges that they will help Native peoples begin a process of becoming civilized, which is a sort of vague concept that Americans and before them, most European settlers thought of as a process that involved Native peoples basically ceasing to be Native and becoming more like Europeans. That is, speaking English, practicing Protestant religion, living in individual farms that were held as private property, and conducting themselves as, farmers. And so this is the process that they say that they'll pledge themselves to, and it creates a sort of ongoing relationship between the federal government and the nations that are established on territory claimed by them, but still controlled mostly by Native people.
Were the Anishinaabe and other Indigenous peoples okay with the Treaty of Greenville? Did they really relish the idea of becoming more American-like as farmers?
Not necessarily. The treaty resolved the conflict, so they were a part of that treaty in that sense. They weren't happy about ceding the territory. That's why they had entered into the conflict in the first place. And they believed they were owed fair compensation for the land they've been forced to cede with that treaty. And so in that sense, they welcomed the annuities that they received. But it also has significant political consequence for Native peoples in that as allies, Indigenous nations are just that, they're allies. They are sort of co-equals in a relationship among sovereign nations. The treaty process transforms that and makes Indigenous nations and their leaders a bit more like clients rather than allies, so a bit more like subordinates in a political relationship as opposed to allies in a political relationship. And so in that sense, it's a shift that is dramatic and has what ultimately can only be considered negative consequences for Native people.
We've talked a fair bit about treaties and how the new United States used treaties to gain at least nominal control over Native lands in the Old Northwest Territory and the Great Lakes region. But we haven't yet talked about the treaty-making process. Now, we need to take a moment to acknowledge our episode sponsor. We are thankful for their support. And when we get back, we'll investigate how the Anishinaabe and United States negotiated treaties with each other. How did Black people sustain their vision for freedom through the rise of Jim Crow? In the second season of Seizing Freedom, Dr. Kadada E. Williams will join a host of artists, intellectuals, and activists to explore answers to this question. The first African-American generation after emancipation really had to grapple with the lessons passed down to them after Reconstruction. Should they turn inward and form their own institutions? Or should they continue to push for their constitutionally enshrined equality? Should they continue to remain living in the South? Or should they move to the North or West? Seizing Freedom's 8 narrative episodes in Season 2 will show how individuals and groups wrestled with these questions, and how they laid the foundation for the burgeoning civil rights movement. And complementary interview episodes discuss how the legacy of this time period in United States history still impacts the nation today. Seizing Freedom is a co-production of Virginia Public Media and Molten Heart. You can listen to Season 2 of Seizing Freedom wherever you get your podcasts. For listeners who served or worked with the United States Marine Corps, or who may have friends and family who might have, I'd like to notify you about an available resource. From 1953 to 1987, personnel who were assigned to Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune were potentially exposed to contaminated drinking water. Now, the Marine Corps has since partnered with health agencies to conduct scientific studies to assess impacts from these potential exposures. And they're working to keep those Marines, their families, and civilian employees informed with updates and resources available to them. If you or someone you know may have been at Camp Lejeune between 1953 and 1987, please consider registering with the Camp Lejeune Historic Drinking Water Notification Database. You can register and learn more at marines.mil/CL water. That's marines.mil/CL water. Now, before we get back to our conversation with Michael, I thought you might like to know that the Omohundro Institute and its publishing partner, the University of North Carolina Press, are offering you a special discount on Michael's book. You can save 40% on Seeing Red. So if you'd like to learn more about the incorporation of native lands into the new United States and take a deeper dive into Michael's groundbreaking research. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/seeingred and use promo code 01BFW at the checkout. That's benfranklinsworld.com/seeingred and use promo code 01BFW and you'll save 40%. Michael, would you tell us what went into the treaty-making process between the young United States and Indigenous peoples like the Anishinaabe? Were treaties something that Native Americans traveled to, say, New York City, Philadelphia, or Washington, D.C. to make with the new United States? You know, those cities having been the capitals of the young United States? Or did U.S. representatives go out into the Great Lakes region to meet with Native peoples and create treaties on their land?
That's a great question. And the answer is both. The U.S., for the most part, they are going to Indian Territory and negotiating treaties. And so to give you an example, the Treaty of Saginaw in 1819 in Michigan Territory is pushed by Lewis Cass, who is the governor of Michigan Territory. And this is a treaty that he's negotiated. He's just negotiated two treaties in the Ohio Country in 1817 and 1818. Those treaties ceded huge portions of the Ohio Territory to the United States, in part because there was such a growing demographic pressure. The Ohio Country settles really fast because if you settle in the Ohio Country, you can essentially replicate the sort of life as an individual yeoman farmer that you would have had in Western Massachusetts or Western Pennsylvania. You have access to the Ohio River, the Maumee River, to the Mississippi, and with Mississippi to the U.S. markets in St. Louis and New Orleans. You can take the products of your labor, of your farm, and get those into the total economy of the United States. But if you are in Michigan Territory, before the creation of the Erie Canal, central and northern Michigan, you don't have access to U.S. markets because there's not easy access to this river system until the creation of the Erie Canal. And so there's just less population pressure. And Lewis Cass feels this difference. Ohio goes from being a territory to a state rapidly. I think it's a state by 1803. It acquires 60,000 free inhabitant population rapidly. Doesn't even have to go through a territorial period. It's immediately created as a state. It enters the Union. Michigan Territory is created as a territory in 1805, but the population is so low that it doesn't make that progress toward statehood. And one of the things that Lewis Cass tries to do is he tries to replicate his success in the Ohio Country, where he sort of coercively forced Native peoples to cede this territory. The original treaties that I mentioned, where he went out to Ohio Country in 1817 and forced this cession of almost all of northern Ohio to the United States, the indigenous people involved in this treaty, which were a combination of Wyandot or Huron and Anishinaabe peoples, initially said, no, we won't cede the territory. But Indian agents who were working with Lewis Cass, so most of the Native peoples had agents who were associated with them. These were employees of the federal government who served as sort of go-betweens between the indigenous nation and the representatives of the territorial government, who helped facilitate things like trade or annuities, payments, things like that. The Indian agents associated with the Potawatomi basically told the collection of Indians that if they didn't cede the territory because they were saying, no, we won't cede it, that they would cede it on their behalf. So in other words, they were told, either you cede the territory at the time of the treaty, or we'll say that you've done it and do it on your behalf. And so they are eventually forced to cede this territory. It's a massive land cession. It helps facilitate the rapid growth and expansion of Ohio. Lewis Cass wants to replicate that in Michigan, where there's less pressure for land. And so in 1819, he goes out to Saginaw and sort of forces a negotiation of a treaty with a significant land cession. And in that case, he is doing the same thing. He's incorporating Indian agents and interpreters who are often intermarried or incorporated within the tribes and sort of using them to help push Native peoples to making a land cession they don't want to make. And they're able to successfully negotiate a treaty that is negotiated in their territory and is partly accomplished with the help of the people who are acting as sort of mediators because they are connected to Native communities. But in other instances, they bring Native people to the seat of power in the U.S. So similarly in Michigan, which in spite of this treaty does not become hugely populous, again, because there's lack of market access until the Erie Canal. But once the Erie Canal is in place, you get a rapid shift in population in Michigan. So in 1820, 15 years after the creation of Michigan as a territory, there was still less than 10,000 non-native settlers in Michigan. After the opening of the Erie Canal in 1826, that population flips, and you have well over 80,000 people in the territory in the 1830s. And so this allows Lewis Cass to sort of push another treaty And in this case, he takes the representatives of the Ojibwe and the Odawa peoples who are in northern Michigan and brings them to Washington, D.C. to negotiate a treaty there. And in that case, the instance is taking Native peoples to the seat of power because it removes them from their community and makes it easier to sort of exert the sort of coercion on them because they can be free from the sort of peer pressure they would feel at home to not cede territory. So the government does both things. It goes to Native territory, enforces treaty negotiations, and sometimes brings Native peoples to the seat of power in a place like Washington City, or now Washington, D.C., and negotiates there when they feel the need to remove people from their communities in order to exert pressure on them. So it happens in both ways.
It sounds like from your description that one of the methods the United States employed in making a treaty with Native peoples was to take leaders and other representatives away from their homelands when they hesitated to sell their lands so that they could be enticed with positive pressure from the United States to sell away their lands and territory rather than face the negative pressure from other Anishinaabe peoples to hold on to their lands. Now, I also have to wonder about ceremony in making these treaties and whether treaties like the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw you mentioned were ever negotiated with great ceremony and with the idea that the United States was actually treating with equal sovereign Native nations. So, Michael, could you tell us about the role that ceremony played in the making of treaties that ceded lands in the Great Lakes and Old Northwest territories?
So the Treaty of Saginaw, it's not a one-day affair. It's not something where you make an appointment, show up at noon. These are processes that are going to last for 1 or 2 weeks at least. The Treaty of Saginaw, there's a lot of work in preparation for that treaty. So various traders showed up to the treaty grounds that were agreed to by the federal government, who would be acting as a host, and the Ojibwe peoples in the Saginaw Village community. They set up the treaty ground, and as they establish a sort of treaty council space, they create a sort of large enclosed area for the treaty negotiations to happen. They then bring in supplies because you're going to have to be feeding a large Indigenous community. At the Treaty of Saginaw, there were thousands of Native people, Anishinaabe people who showed up for the treaty. There would be elaborate ceremonies when the councils were called. There would be a sort of ritual smoking of the calumet, the sort of reaffirmation of peace between the federal government and the Indigenous tribes. There'd be exchange of gifts. There'd be feeding of peoples. There would be a negotiation where the U.S. officials, in this case, Lewis Cass, the territorial governor, would be acting also as a treaty commissioner, would explain the demands of the federal government. And they would use the language that the U.S. had adapted from earlier empires, where they configured the chief executive of the United States as the father figure and Native people as his children, and creating this sort of illusion of a fictive kinship relationship. And so the U.S. commissioners would then say that they were speaking on behalf of their American father, the president, and would make demands about land. And these speeches would be then translated into Anishinaabe by traders, often intermarried with Native people. Most of the traders were intermarried, had Native wives, had mixed-race families, and then they would translate the words of the governor. And then the various Ogima, or leaders of the Saginaw Bay Village community, would stand up and respond. And in this case, in the Treaty of Saginaw, initially they were rejecting the idea of a treaty. They said that we don't want to cede additional land. You've called the treaty. We didn't call the treaty. You're asking for land. We're not willing to sell land. There's a back and forth. And then Lewis Cass is saying, we need land for our growing population. You need trade goods. This is an exchange that will benefit you. So it's a back and forth. And the Indigenous people of the Treaty of Saginaw were really reluctant to cede land. In fact, were refusing to do so. And the treaty process sort of reaches a stalemate. And in this case, it gets resolved because different traders who are very much invested in this treaty process begin to sort of pull aside different tribal leaders and try to convince them to make a cession. And this eventually happens with an individual trader named Jacob Smith, who's able to get a Saginaw Ogima named Noim to enter into an agreement with him that they would go to the governor and agree to cede territory in exchange for land cessions, extra land cessions going to Noim and his children. And so with this, the sort of dam breaks because the other leaders see that Noim and Jacob Smith are negotiating a deal and they worry that they will lose out. There's a fear that Native people have that if they don't ultimately sign the treaty and concede title to their land, the land will be taken anyway and they won't be compensated. So at this point, there is sort of a breaking point. One of the leaders has conceded, and so they signed a treaty. It is still contentious. There's been a big land cession. Some of the leaders from the Saginaw community refused to sign the treaty, but others do sign it, and the U.S. has sort of achieved its goal that they've gotten a document that will stand up in court as a document that cedes a really large section of territory in exchange for an annuity. The annuity is a combination of cash payments and trade goods and provisions that will be given annually for a period of 20 years. And the fur traders who are involved in helping push this process are eager for it to go forward because they in turn can claim portions of that annuity for debt. So all the different traders who've been involved in this, people like Jacob Smith, are claiming that in fact they are owed $10,000, $20,000, whatever amount of money that they are claiming as debt unpaid from Native peoples in the fur trade. And so when the annuity payment does get paid, the cash portion of it, they will literally take the vast majority of that and claim as debt.
Treaty payment is something we need to investigate further, as is this developing phenomenon that you refer to as the economy of plunder. But before we get into those descriptions, I'm struck by how complicated and even dangerous sounding this treaty-making process must have been between the young United States and the Anishinaabe peoples. You happen to mention that at the Treaty of Saginaw, there were an awful lot of translators, and that these translators were often fur traders who were looking to cut all sorts of deals, and they were cutting these deals. First, they made money off of the food and supplies needed to host the treaty. Then they were pulling ogamas and tribal leaders away from their families and peoples to try and convince them that they should sell land based on their personal interests, in the case of the ogama who's getting extra land cessions for his family. And then when the treaty payments come in, it sounds like these fur traders have organized it so that they get most of the cash from these annuity payments, not the Anishinaabe people who sold and lost their homelands. So, Michael, it sounds like there were so many opportunities for misunderstandings to take place with the Treaty of Saginaw. And so I wonder, were there misunderstandings that actually occurred with this treaty?
The treaty processes are always really complicated. They're always contentious. And for the most part, this is also because the Indigenous peoples in the Old Northwest, the Anishinaabe peoples particularly, don't want to cede territory. And especially in places like Michigan in the 1820s and 30s, there's not a lot of pressure for that territory the way there is in, say, Indiana or Ohio, where, as I said, you can access the U.S. markets. And so there's a lot of settlement pressure and pressure on Native peoples to cede land to an American settler population that wants it. In Michigan and Wisconsin, there's no pressure. And so there's less of an immediate move for this, but there are complicated elements involved with different traders. The other thing that's happening is that the fur trade, which has been a sort of vibrant source of the economy of the Great Lakes region from the moment of European colonization, is beginning to wind down, particularly as places in the Northwest Territory become settled, places like Ohio and Indiana. That changes the nature of fur trade. It makes it less possible to practice the sort of seasonal round we talked about earlier, because so much of your territory is now being owned as private property, which not only changes your access to land, but even can change the landscape, the game populations, things like that. So the fur trade is becoming less viable as a sort of way of life. And the fur traders in Michigan Territory can see this coming. They can see the fact of their livelihood being something that will go away. And by the time you hit the 1820s and 30s, with this sort of end of the fur trade in sight, they are huge factors in pushing these treaties, because the fur trade treaties are the treaties that offer them a way of cashing out of the fur trade by getting their clients or their relatives to enter into treaty relations with the U.S. that cede territory, and then getting annuities for that territory. They can claim portions of those annuities as debt. So it's a complicated process, and there are multiple players with different angles. And so it's not always the federal government that's driving the treaty process, but often a combination of people. And then as we hit the time period around 1830 with the Indian Removal Act, there is added pressure that the federal government will try to forcibly remove them from their homeland and move them out west. So all these things are factors that are incorporated into the treaty negotiations between Native peoples and the federal government and state and territorial officials.
Okay, we should talk about money. As you've written in your book, Seeing Red, and as you've been telling us all throughout our conversation, there was a transition during which the early republic paid for Indian lands in tangible goods to actually paying Native Americans for their land with annuities or annual payments over a finite period of time. I think you mentioned that the Treaty of Saginaw was over a period of 20 years. Why did this transition in payment take place? Why did the United States government shift away from a long tradition of payment through gifts to paying out hard cash and gifts with an annuity payment?
Gift giving is introduced as an important component of alliance relationships early on with the establishment of European empire. So the French traders who are trying to create an ongoing relationship with native peoples as trade partners do so in part by both embracing an idea of establishing fictive kinship, that is a kinship connection, but they also do so in part through gift giving, often give gifts of tobacco, alcohol, food, things that you would give to somebody within your own family. So these gifts establish both your sort of giving to the other community and the idea that having given a gift, you can expect a comparable gift in return. So you create the idea of sort of an uneven exchange or an ongoing exchange relationship through the exchange of gifts, creating an obligation between one person and another, but also gifts that signify the things that one family member owes to another. So gift giving very quickly becomes part of the ritual process that is associated with the fur trade exchange, and that it's not just a business transaction where you are exchanging X number of manufactured trade goods for X number of beaver pelts. It's very much enveloped within this larger sort of relationship that involves giving gifts or things that are thought of as meeting the needs of your trading partner, who are being sort of understood as your kin. And so you meet the needs of your kin, and then you meet the needs of your trading partner. So gift giving and exchange very quickly become intertwined, and you don't have one without the other. So any gift giving or any fur trade exchange is usually accompanied by a ceremony smoking of a calumet, gifts of tobacco, often gifts of wampum, which is this sort of belts that are made from seashells that are of ritual significance to signify alliance between native communities, between native and European powers. So all these different gifts that are given in exchange create both a sense of ongoing relationship and mutual obligation. And that's how alliance relationships are structured. They're restructured through the annuity process because it becomes something that is given often in exchange for the extinction of title or land, the transfer of land from native people to the colonizing power, but also it kind of creates not a sort of ongoing social relationships between equals as a kind of client relationship between indigenous leaders and the colonizing power. And in that sense, the client relationship gives the U.S. a leverage because now the fur trade is being sort of subsumed by the treaty process. As I mentioned, the fur trade is sort of winding down. Treaty processes and annuities become more important because there are less trade goods flowing into native communities. And the goods that are coming into native communities come increasingly from this treaty process and the annual gifts of annuities that come from the federal government as opposed to the ongoing exchange that is occurring as a result of the harvesting of furs and the exchange of processed peltry for trade goods.
I'm really glad we've been able to talk at some length about the creation of the Treaty of Saginaw in 1819, because it really has shown us the different aspects of the treaty-making process. It's shown us who was involved in this treaty-making process, why the United States wanted to shift from this long tradition of gift-giving to paying for land and annuity payments, which signaled a business transaction rather than a transaction of alliance. And it's also important because you note in your book, Seeing Red, that it's the Treaty of Saginaw in 1819 that represents the introduction of what you see as the political economy of plunder. So would you tell us what the political economy of plunder is or was?
If we think about the United States east of the Mississippi after the Revolution, the territory that the people in the early republic called the Old Southwest, territory from Georgia through Arkansas, very quickly comes into demand because of the growth of king cotton. And there's a massive demographic pressure to take that land from Indian people and transform it into private property as a result of cotton production. In territories like Michigan, Wisconsin, there's far less population pressure to settle these territories. So settlement doesn't occur as rapidly. But one of the things that ends up driving economic growth in the absence of something like cotton production is the sort of relationship between the territory or state, the federal government, and Indian tribal communities. And the treaty process that we've discussed here at length is a process where a lot of money is changing hands. So as we mentioned, the people who are facilitating the treaty process, the merchants and traders who are associated with the fur trade, are the people who the federal government taps to provide the provisions for that treaty process. So they're making money from the provisioning of a 1 to 2 week treaty process. The treaty is negotiated. During the process of that negotiation, land is ceded and an annuity is agreed upon. That annuity maybe is $20,000 in cash and $10,000 in goods and provisions. Of the $20,000 in cash annual payment, traders are able to come in and demand large portions of that cash annuity as something that is owed to them as debt for trade that has not been made good on. So they're making money in that instance again. Then a portion of that annuity that is trade goods and provisions, the federal government will use those same traders and merchants to purchase the provisions and trade goods, that is food and trade commodities, to give to the native peoples as part of their annuity. So again, they're making money in the third way. And then the small amount of cash that does get to native peoples don't have bank accounts. They need to convert that cash into something that can facilitate the sort of political economy of their communities. So they take the cash and buy trade goods and food provisions from the same merchant. So at every step of this treaty process, the merchants are making money. They're making cash money. And in a region like the Northwest Territory in the 1830s, cash is often in short supply. So this is a form of specie that is circulating in the political economy of the Northwest Territory that is coming through this ongoing relationship with the federal government and native peoples that is falling into the hands of people who are essentially the big boosters of Michigan Territory, Ohio Territory, or Wisconsin Territory. All that cash flow is something that becomes kind of this political economy of plunder, transferring native wealth to the settler population. And it's a source of economic development in places like Michigan or Wisconsin because this is the main source of revenue entering the state. There are something like 4 times the amount of money enters the state through treaty negotiations and annuity payments and provisioning that is appropriated by the Congress for the development of regional infrastructure. So the way that these regional businessmen are sort of capitalizing their businesses is through the treaty process and through this sort of political economy that takes the colonized population of Indigenous people and extracts wealth both in the sense of transferring their most tangible asset, land, out of their possession into the public domain in the United States, but then also taking vast majorities of the compensation for that land transfer and claiming it through debt or as a service that's provided to facilitate this transfer. And so it's a political economy that really evolves around the ongoing colonial relationship between the federal and state governments and Indigenous people.
Wow. It doesn't sound like the Anishinaabe made any money from selling their homelands. It sounds like you had these treaty ceremonies and that the whole thing was geared to have Native Americans cede their land so that they were not only dispossessed from the land, but that all of the money they generated from the sale of their homelands would go right back to the settler population and to the traders. This was the money that was being used to develop the Great Lakes region so that it could be farmed.
Absolutely. The economic growth of the Northwest Territories comes through the treaty process, particularly in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, where you have really large Indigenous populations. You know, as a point of contrast, I mentioned Indian removal. Native peoples are forcibly removed from most of the Southeast, in part because their land is so valuable, and the U.S. sort of engages in this process of Indian removal. In the Northwest Territories that I mentioned, the Native peoples aren't removed, in part because there's less demographic pressure to remove them, and then also in part because they become a valuable form of economic development. The treaty process that is in place with them remaining on the land is more lucrative and driving the economy than it would have been to remove them. So it's a tragedy in that Native peoples don't benefit from this, but it also is a way in which the U.S. sort of functions as a colonial power extracting wealth from a colonized population in order to develop that territory for the federal government and for the state.
As we've been talking about the treaty-making process, it has occurred to me that in our own present day, it would be really easy for us to boil down these treaties into black and white terms, into terms of winners and losers. I mean, take the Treaty of Saginaw that we've been talking about. It's easy to see how the Anishinaabe would be the big losers in these treaty negotiations. They lost their land. They didn't really receive any of the money they were promised from those land sales. And any of the economic development and benefit that they would have had from their land sales really seemed to serve and benefit the settler population, not the Anishinaabe. So, Michael, is this a good way for us to view treaties like the Treaty of Saginaw? Should we view them in these simplified black and white terms and in terms of winners and losers?
Treaties are one of the founding documents of the Republic. Just like the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, not unlike the Northwest Ordinance, It's the treaties that represent the legal mechanisms that facilitate the transfer of indigenous homelands into the public domain of the United States, which is then transformed into private property. So they're absolutely indispensable for the founding, creation, and expansion of the United States. But they're also often tragically corrupt in terms of taking wealth from Native people and not fairly compensating them. And so in that sense, they are often, I think, unfair. They are a way by which the United States is able to sort of capitalize on the wealth of Native peoples and make it the wealth of the Republic. On the other hand, one of the things that you have to recognize in terms of these treaties that are hammered out in the Northwest Territory is that Anishinaabe people are able to remain in their homeland in a time period when most other indigenous people east of the Mississippi are being forcibly removed. And so in that sense, while Anishinaabe people lose the vast majority of their homeland, they're able to retain parts of their homeland, to remain on their land, to remain in their home territories, and to negotiate a place for themselves in a republic where they are not citizens. And Native people in the early republic after the Revolution are not citizens of the United States. They are different than white settlers or different than, say, free black settlers or enslaved people. They are not people who are incorporated into the Constitution and laws of the United States, but they are able to sort of negotiate a place within the sort of social compact of the early republic by maintaining themselves on their lands. And ironically or tragically, sometimes these same fur traders and people who are intermarried among them who facilitate their dispossession, often doing so because they're desperately trying to hold on to something instead of losing everything, make it possible. They also, even while they're sort of participating in this sort of fleecing of their native relatives, they're also sort of helping facilitate this move to stay in their homelands, to maximize what they can in a situation where they are otherwise placed at a terrible disadvantage.
One of the benefits of studying history is that we can learn from lessons of the past. We can learn about the legacies of acts and treaties and then learn from those acts and treaties. So, Michael, what lessons do you hope that we and the readers of Seeing Red will take away from your investigation of the many treaties that the Anishinaabe made with the young United States?
I think the big takeaway that I would like people to have is to recognize that the U.S. does not expand west into an unsettled territory. Even to this day, you get politicians who talk about the taming of the wilderness and the settlement of North America. And I think getting people to understand that, in fact, North America was indigenous territory, it was indigenous homeland, that it wasn't a process of settling an unsettled territory or taming a wilderness, but rather a systematic process of dispossessing Native people. That's how America expanded, through this engagement with Native North America and a constant negotiation about who belongs and who doesn't belong, what the meaning of space and territory would be. And to see American history and Native history as intertwined and inseparable in that sense. You can't separate one from the other. And so the big takeaway would be just that we recognize that the United States became the United States at the expense of Native people. And that it wasn't the sort of conquest of a continent that was unsettled and uncivilized, but rather the transformation of a continent from being an indigenous space to being the territory and space of the American Republic. And just recognizing that the United States owes this great debt to Native North American and Native people.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if the United States had sought to negotiate with the Anishinaabe on more equal terms than it did in the 18th and 19th centuries? What might life in Anishinaabe look like today?
That's a really interesting question. You can see elements of this possible alternative history in the actual history itself. There is a moment in time when the United States is thinking about negotiating with the peoples of what would become the Minnesota Territory and creating space that would be a sort of permanent reservation where they would relocate all the Great Lakes and Native peoples into this territory, and that this territory would remain indigenous until, from an American perspective, they became civilized and would maybe then incorporate into the Union as an indigenous state. So there are different moments in time where settlers, citizens, and politicians in the United States are trying to imagine a place for Native people in the Republic where they can still be Native and that they might enter the Republic in some form, become an Indigenous state or Indigenous citizens, but they might make this transition. And I think along with this idea that maybe we could have figured out a way to negotiate a place for Native people where they might sort of negotiate their status within the Republic to allow them to maintain their homelands, their sovereignty, their dignity, their possession. You can also think about the fact that often in places like Michigan and Wisconsin, the U.S. is pressuring Native peoples to cede territory when there isn't really even a demand for it. And so a lot of the territory that's ceded in treaties in the 1830s in Michigan and Wisconsin enters the public domain in far larger quantities than there is a demand for it. And so it sits in public domain for a long time. And the land grant treaties, the Morrill Act that creates the basis for establishing land grant treaties for all the states in the Union, that is funded through the transfer of land scripts from native land where the title has been extinguished and has been placed in the public domain and turned into financial instruments. Land scripts are given to the different individual states who then can transfer this or sell it off or invest themselves in the land and use the capital from that to fund their land grant universities, to form the endowment for those universities. So by the same token, if we had simply left people in northern Wisconsin or northern Michigan in possession of their territory, not forced them to sell it and put it in the domain, if they could have held on to that resource as they hit into the 19th century, they would have had a resource base that would have allowed them to have a substantial form of wealth that would have really transformed their lives, their ability to sort of incorporate themselves at a later date into the Republic with the sort of wealth and power that comes with landed wealth in North America.
Now that Seeing Red is out in the world, Michael, what are you researching and writing about now?
I'm working on a project now that I'm kind of calling tentatively the Battle for North America. And I'm looking at writing an Indigenous history of the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, and the War of 1812, which I see as this sort of interconnected conflict between Native peoples that are largely confederated, as we discussed earlier, east of the Mississippi, who see themselves increasingly in battle and competition with the various Anglo and French settlements in North America for control over their homelands, Indigenous territory. By around the 7 Years' War, Native people realize that this is what the struggle is about, that they're facing a sort of onslaught of settler expansion, and that these conflicts are all ways in which Native people are trying to negotiate or defend themselves against the expansion of settler powers into Indigenous territory. And so I want to take a look at these conflicts and think about them not from the perspective of European Empire, but from the perspective of Native peoples.
And how can we contact you if we have more questions about the history of the Anishinaabe, the Old Northwest Territory, the Great Lakes region, or even treaty making in the early United States?
I can be reached by email, my Columbia University address, mw3528 at columbia.edu. Best way to get in touch with me. I'm also on Twitter at mjwicken.
Michael Wicken, thank you for joining us and for introducing us to the Anishinaabe peoples and for taking us through the history of treaty making in the Old Northwest Territory.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
A large part of American identity comes from the idea that pioneering and innovative Americans worked hard and traveled west to tame and farm the lands of North America from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And if we think about it, this idea is one that really predates the United States. It really begins with the idea that hardworking and pious Britons left English shores and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to settle in a new world. But what we must remember about this story is that it is, in fact, an embellished story. Yes, there were, in fact, hardworking, pioneering, pious, and innovative Britons who sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to settle in a new-to-them world. It is also known that many ancestors of these initial colonists also made their way west across the continent after the American Revolution. But there were also many unpious people and people who did not have a British ancestry who made their way to North America, either by force or by their own accord. And these people also played a big role in settling and developing the North American continent. Now, we must remember that the North American lands these colonists settled on, and which may have very well appeared to be unsettled lands to them, were and are in fact the homelands of many Native American peoples. As Michael stated, the lands of North America and the lands incorporated into the present-day United States were and are Indigenous lands. Lands that Native American peoples learned how to use and exist on over millennia. Which brings us to the biggest takeaway Michael would like us to walk away with. The United States did not expand west into uninhabited and unsettled territory. It expanded into Indigenous territory. And as we discussed with Michael, American expansion into Indigenous territory often meant dispossession of Native American peoples, which is a big part of the reason why the history of early America is so intertwined with the history of Native America. Now, while we may have already understood or thought we understood this point, Michael's research makes plain that the United States became the United States we live in today, in large part because of this history of Native American dispossession, a history that also includes not just the removal of Indigenous peoples from their land, but also the use of Indigenous wealth to develop and settle their homelands with American settlers, a process that we could clearly see in what Michael describes as the political economy of plunder. The political economy of plunder was a process by which the United States government forced Indigenous peoples, like the Anishinaabe, to sell and cede titles to their land. The United States then in turn used the monies and annual payments for Indigenous lands to repay Indigenous debts to American traders who also made money by selling other goods to Native peoples and from the United States government. As time went on, rich traders continued to use the monies they made from Native American peoples to invest in and assist with infrastructure and trade projects that made the lands in the Old Northwest Territory more desirable for Americans to settle on. The political economy of plunder, the economy that made the early United States into the geographically expansive nation that it is today. The political economy of plunder took Native wealth and transferred that wealth to the American settler population, which is why Michael hopes we'll walk away from this conversation recognizing that Native peoples helped the United States become the United States, that they made the United States what it is today not through conquest, but because of their land and the wealth derived from their land. Look for more information about Michael, his book, Seeing Red, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/323. If you enjoyed today's episode and you'd like to go deeper into Michael's research, the Omohundro Institute and its publishing partner, the University of North Carolina Press, are offering you the chance to purchase a copy of Michael's book, Seeing Red, at a 40% discount. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/seeingred and use promo code 01BFW. That's benfranklinsworld.com/seeingred and use promo code 01BFW and you'll save 40%. This episode of Ben Franklin's World is supported by an American Rescue Plan grant to the Omohundro Institute from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team: Joseph Edelman, Jessica Brabble, Martha Howard, and Holly White. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, where and who in Native North America would you like to visit next? Let me know. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute and is sponsored by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation.